Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is frighten, and this verb was suggested by the viewer Luis. Luis, thank you so much for this suggestion. This is a great verb for the month of October, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move along. So now let's begin our discussion today by reviewing some of the definitions or the ways that we use this verb. The first way you might encounter the verb frighten being used means to make someone afraid or anxious. Related to that is the second definition, to become afraid or anxious. So, again, sometimes it helps to have a synonym. So the verb scare comes to my mind, right? And the reason this seems like a great verb for the month of October is in the United States, at the end of October, it is the holiday Halloween. And that particular holiday has a lot of customs with it, but something that is very common is to have scary things. Some people will seek out things to do that may frighten them. So, like watching scary movies or going to a haunted place. Okay. Now, a third way you might encounter the verb frighten being used means to deter someone or something from involvement or action in something by making them afraid. So really the idea is you're stopping or preventing someone from doing something by causing that feeling of fear. For now, you should know that frighten is a regular verb. If you want to make the progressive form of this verb, all you need to do is add ing, and that forms frightening. The past tense and the participle forms of this verb can be made by adding ed. Now, our base verb, frighten, ends in a voiced N sound. This means my ed ending is just going to make a D sound, and I'm not going to add an extra syllable as I say it. The past tense and the participle forms of the verb should sound like this: frightened, frightened. Okay. Now, there are actually a number of phrasal verbs connected to this verb, so we're going to focus our discussion today on these different phrasal verbs and how they might use them. I'll try to remember to review verb tenses as we look at the examples. Now, the first phrasal verb you might encounter is to frighten away. When people use this, they're talking about scaring a person or maybe scaring an animal away from a particular place or thing. An example of this might be, the noise and lights will frighten away any potential burglars. So here's an example of a simple future sentence. Someone might be making a promise or a prediction. They're installing something that they think will scare and therefore keep people away from maybe a building or something of that nature. Another phrasal verb you might encounter is to frighten in. Again, this can mean to scare or intimidate a person or an animal into entering a particular place or thing. An example of that, she frightened her tiny dog in to prevent the larger one from attacking. So in this example, we've got some simple past tense, right? And maybe this dog owner perceived or recognized kind of a looming danger. So to get her animal to react more quickly, right, she does something that's going to scare and make the dog run inside. Another phrasal verb you might encounter is to frighten into. This can have a couple different meanings. One way is very similar to the last thing we just discussed. So we're scaring or intimidating someone into doing something. An example of this: the older kids frightened him into giving them his money. So maybe you've seen this in movies or TV shows. I really hope you don't have personal experience with it, but this would be a good example of bullying. This is another simple past tense sentence. So the kids might have said things, they might have suggested, like, I'm going to hurt you, so give me the money you have, right? They scared or intimidated this younger child. Another way to use frighten into means to scare or intimidate someone into entering a particular place or maybe entering a thing. An example of this: she frightened her dog into his crate. So here you might think kind of a smaller type of thing that keeps a dog more confined in a particular space. Again, simple past tense there. The third way you might hear frighten into used means to scare one into a particular emotional state. Okay? So here we're not talking about physically moving or physically doing something, but we're causing really strong feelings when we use this meaning. An example of it might be, not hearing from you for 2 days frightened me into a panic. So I'm explaining that the lack of action, right? Maybe this person didn't respond to my text messages, didn't respond to my phone calls. And it made me feel, oh no, I'm a bit panicked. I'm worried. Has something bad happened to this person? Okay. Another simple past tense sentence there. Let's move on to another phrasal verb you might encounter: to frighten off. This can mean we are scaring a person or an animal, again, away from a particular place or away from some object, something. An example of this: don't frighten off our guests with your bad behavior. Now, I feel like I heard my parents say this to my brother and me a few times, where they didn't think we were behaving well and we had company at the house. This is an imperative. It's a command, right? So what they're saying is, like, you might be acting so badly that people are like, oh, we got to leave here. So hopefully, again, that hasn't happened to you. Another phrasal verb you might encounter is to frighten out of. This can also have a few different meanings. One way to use frighten out of means to cause someone or an animal to leave someplace by scaring them. An example of this: have you frightened the squirrel out of the basement? Here's an example of a present perfect question. Okay, so kind of want to know, is this action completed? Maybe yet. Okay. A second way to use frighten out of can mean to use fear to cause someone to avoid doing something or to stop doing something. An example of this: the teacher frightened him out of dropping out. Okay, so that's another simple past tense sentence. The teacher frightened him out of dropping out. That phrase, dropping out, is very commonly used to talk about someone who's leaving school before they graduate or before they finish a particular program. A third way to use frighten out means to cause someone to divulge or part with something by threatening them. So divulge might be to say, to speak. So this might be sharing a secret, sharing something personal. Or it could be a physical possession, right? So to part with, kind of give up. An example of this: did the police frighten a confession out of the suspect? That's a yes or no question in the simple past tense there, right? And again, we're talking about sort of causing this person to speak, maybe not in the best way, by threatening them, making them feel fear. Now let's move on and talk about some other words and a phrase related to our verb of the day, frighten. The first word we're going to discuss is just the noun form of this word. The noun is fright, okay? And that's really just a sudden, intense feeling of fear. An example of how you might hear this used in a sentence: he had such intense stage fright that he stopped performing. Okay, so maybe you've heard about this. It's a very real thing that people can experience. So they're going to be in front of a crowd, maybe to sing, to perform, and just sort of knowing that everyone is looking at them, right, causes these feelings of anxiety, of fear, and it might prevent them from continuing to perform. Another word you might encounter is the adjective frightened. Okay, now we said this is the past tense form, same spelling, same pronunciation here. When we use this adjective with the ed ending, we're talking about having the feeling of being afraid or anxious. So an example of this, the frightened dog started to bark loudly, right? So here, the dog has that intense feeling. And I always like to contrast this with the adjective frightening. That's got that ing ending, just like our progressive form of the verb. But when we use this adjective, we're describing something that causes the feeling of being afraid or being anxious. So an example, that was a frightening sound, right? So I'm saying the sound made me feel that particular way. Okay, so that's an easy mistake for many people learning English to make the difference between our adjectives with ed endings and those with ing. Now I've got one phrase. Sorry, I got ahead. I forgot the adjective frightful. Pardon. The adjective frightful can be used two different ways. One can mean to cause intense fear or alarm. So an example of this, the haunted train is a truly frightful experience. I saw an advertisement like this, again, connected to the celebration of Halloween and that idea of we like scary things where maybe there are ghosts, some people perceive other kind of made up creatures that might make you, right, have that feeling. So frightful is describing experience, and they're saying that during this train ride, you're going to feel the feeling. Now, a second way you might hear frightening used is really more for emphasis, and they'll use it to really stress that there's something bad. Let's take a look at an example of that. Your bedroom is a frightful mess. Again, something we might hear parents say to their children, right? And what they're saying, it's not that this causes me fear and I'm worried necessarily, but they're trying to emphasize just how bad. So it's not like the room's a little messy, it's extremely messy. Now let's move on to that phrase I promised you. You might hear someone say, frighten someone to death, or instead of someone, you might see an object pronoun there. Now, we call this a phrase or an idiom, and the meaning with idioms are not literal, right? So you might think death and dying, but here we don't really mean that. But what we mean when someone uses this is something caused another person to be extremely frightened or frightened very badly. So, an example of how you might hear it used, that movie frightened me to death, right? So, clearly, if the person's speaking, they're not actually dead, right? But they're trying to emphasize just how frightening or just how scary that particular movie was. Thanks again to Louise for suggesting today's verb. I thank you all for watching, and I hope you have a great day.